Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. Webinar is entitled "The House Divided: Bridging the Gap Between Network and Security Teams." My name is Scott Penny. I'm the Vice President of Field Engagement at Blue Cat Networks, and I'm also the Director of our Cybersecurity Solutions team. I'll be your host and moderator for today's webinar, and I think we're going to have a great conversation today. I think we have a really relevant topic. I doubt anyone would claim really that we live in a world where the various network and security teams integrate and operate seamlessly, and especially not with 100% efficiency. The question for today is, what do we do about that? And we have a couple of guests that have a great deal of experience in this space who are here to share their thoughts and tips on how to start making this a reality. But before we get into our discussion, we do have a couple of minor housekeeping items. First off, today's webinar is being recorded, so if you miss anything or if you want to send this to anyone else who may be interested, you'll receive a link over the next couple of days that you can share. And secondly, we should have some time at the end of the discussion for some audience questions. So if you'd like to ask a question, please submit using the Q&A or question function in the GoToMeeting webinar here, and we'll try to get through as many of those as we can before we finish. All right, let's get going. So first off, I'd like to introduce you to our two subject matter experts for the discussion today. First guest is Matt Devost. Matt is the Executive VP of Strategy and Operations at Toolco. Matt's a technologist, an entrepreneur, an international security expert specializing in cybersecurity, counterterrorism, critical infrastructure protection, intelligence, and risk management issues. And as you can see from some of the organizations Matt has worked with over his career, he's been involved in some incredibly critical and really interesting areas of security. So we're really looking forward to hearing his thoughts on this subject. So welcome, Matt, and thank you for joining us today. Our next guest is Phil Puccio. Phil's the founder and CEO of ELEVI Associates, one of our key partners here at Blue Cat. Phil started ELEVI in 2002 with an eye towards helping his customers fully leverage the potential of their IT investments, really to achieve their overall strategic business results. ELEVI has become one of the leaders in what you may hear people call the DDI space, which stands for DNS, DHCP, and IP address management. But ELEVI also focuses a great deal on cyber defense solutions and spends a lot of time with their customers, helping them with topics like today's. So Phil, great to have you. Welcome aboard.
Thank you.
So remember, before we jump into the conversation here, please do submit questions using that Q&A or question function, and we'll try to get to them at the end of the session today, just to make sure that we address any concerns or thoughts that you guys have. So let's go ahead and get started, and let's jump right in. So to kick things off, let's talk about the big picture here. So we know that network and cyber teams are being pushed together more and more due to the clear dependencies that they have between those functions, but we still seem to see a lot of friction between these two teams. So Matt, maybe let's start with you. So based on your experience working across these silos, what do you think are the key reasons for this?
I think there's a couple of key reasons. One is that there's budget constraints, right? So they tend to be competing for the same budget. So that certainly weighs into the consideration. There often is a different reporting chain. So what is important to the organization from within those two teams comes up through usually two different silos in the organization. There's not a lot of cross collaboration. And then there's not kind of a unified risk management strategy associated with how the organization is thinking about managing risk, and where the network and infrastructure team can contribute to managing that risk and what the security team's concerns are. So where I've seen it work really well is where they have that kind of cooperation, where they have a common goal, where they're engaging in red teaming that highlights the kind of the codependency that exists between the two organizations, and that you recognize that the IT and network component is an incredibly important part of security. In fact, I often joke you can't spell security without IT, right? So you have to be taking that into consideration. And by that same measure, there are a lot of things that can be initiated and funded and done on the network and infrastructure side that have a great contribution from a cybersecurity perspective. I remember, just by way of story, sitting with the CEO of a large Fortune 100 company, and he sat and he said, hey, they had some security issues in the past, and he sat with me and he said, Matt, aren't you proud? I am investing $3.5 million in this great new network intrusion detection system. I'm spending on security. And because I had the kind of unified enterprise approach, I said, sir, that's great. I like that you're thinking about security, but what you're doing is basically the equivalent of installing a smoke detector and fire alarm system in an elementary school where every kid has a book of matches. We've seen in the same budget cycle that you had denied the upgrade for the desktop environment, so it was still Windows XP local admins. If you're a security person, you know how easy that is for an attacker to slice through. But he hadn't correlated, oh, I could spend the money here and get a much greater improvement in security, because it was seen as an IT budget item. So he was picking things off of the security budget, even though they weren't going to make as great a contribution. So that kind of deconfliction of messaging and the approach and kind of mission and values of the organization is important.
Mm-hmm. So it's almost like a sort of a tactical spend in that situation. It was kind of, the guy saw something and he did something very tactical without really considering all of the other factors that he should have probably taken into account.
Absolutely. There wasn't a kind of a unified approach, right? Saying what risks are we trying to manage or what things are we trying to mitigate? And on the network and IT side of the house, they have similar type risks, right? They call them by different names. It might not be an intrusion, but it might be that there's an availability issue, or they might be having constraints on the information flows within the organization, or they might be trying to solve for integrating data from a vendor partner. Right? There are these lists that exist within each organization, but not very often are they deconflicted and unified and looked and saying, how can we contribute to each other's objectives in this space?
Mm-hmm. And that you mentioned, risk management strategy. I mean, that kind of comes down to fully and sort of comprehensively understanding your risk and how you're going to go about attacking them, right?
It does, and it requires an honest approach to it. I've sat down with organizations and said, okay, if we think about what is critical to the organization and we do a bullseye, they want to throw 50% of the darts in the center of the bullseye. But when you sit down and say, what would be, catastrophic to the organization or very consequential, and that you might have to put it on a, financial report or has an impact on the customers, you get down to that 5 to 10% range, right? So you need to make sure that you're taking an appropriate risk management approach. Not everything that is bad can and will happen, but there are risks that you need to manage to. So you have to take a unified approach for that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it doesn't really matter that you're on the network team or the cybersecurity team. It matters that you're part of one organization that needs to do its best to mitigate those risks.
Absolutely, and that kind of needs to be articulated and supported from the top, right? So there's a leadership and culture issue here from the board of directors on down.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yep, for sure. Okay, so given that organizations by and large aren't doing a great job of breaking down these silos, I'd love to get your guys' thoughts on, what's the real impact of maintaining these silos, right? I mean, okay, maybe we don't get a good risk picture, but what else is happening here by having these things as separate, and what does continuing to operate these functions in silos really cost a company?
Sure. So one of the things there that really contributes to cost is some of the hidden costs, and that's getting into the aspects of inaccurate detection, increased false positives. Those types of things really add to the cost of operations of the different business units there. You look at a couple different surveys that are out there these days, and about half of the alerts that come into large organizations, large enterprise type networks, are inaccurate. It takes a lot of thought, a lot of processing to really analyze those, and about 455 hours per week in organizations get spent on those types of things. Different tools that can enable you to automate some of that and get rid of those false positives are one key factor that can help to decrease that cost factor in there.
Yeah, is there a way, I mean, through an engagement or something that we could quantify specifically the cost of this situation?
I guess from that you can look at the hours spent on that, as well as the dollars, as Matt was talking about, spent on different solutions that aren't really well thought through, kind of the point systems that are being implemented in the organizations, rather than a kind of holistic, heterogeneous type environment between networking and security operations teams. Being able to leverage those, have that good communication flow back and forth between the different silos. And again, we talked about silos. They're not necessarily a bad thing in themselves you do need those boundaries between some of the different functions in order to have specialization there. But where they come into play as being an issue is really the competing interests. Everything, as Matt was saying, related to budgets, as well as different agendas. In addition to that, just the nature of what a security person is focused on versus what a network operations person is focused on. In the network operations, you're looking for performance. How fast can you make the network work? How quickly can you serve the information to the end user? That's kind of contrary to what security is looking to do. They want to be able to control that, be able to control the flow of the information, excuse me, of the information, and lock it down to an extent to protect the information, but at the same time, be able to let business operate. So those competing interests between the different silos really tend to cause those inefficiencies. And really what it boils down to is having that visibility and being able to deal with factual information rather than these false positives and things like that.
Yeah, I was talking to a network team not long ago, and one of them made the joke. The network team is really measured on their ability to deliver every single packet wherever it is supposed to go, whereas the secure team is measured on making sure that only the packets that we want to be delivered are actually delivered, right? So there's that clear sort of conflict almost in what kind of service they're providing.
Exactly.
But at the same time, they're playing in the same sandbox, right? So the security team is heavily dependent on the network infrastructure and being able to tap in information there. So there's got to be this middle ground, right?
Yeah, I think
there has to be, and that speed to resolution, especially when you do have an incident that has to be investigated and has to be mitigated. That collaboration between the two of them and having that subject matter expertise from a systems operation, systems administration perspective to a what do we do with it, how do we corral it, and how do we contain the vulnerability there that has been breached.
I definitely would concur. You have a lot of duplication of effort. You have data streams or detection capabilities that perhaps the security team is looking to acquire that already exist within the network team, if right? So instead of managing, trying to find the needle in the haystack, they're spending a lot of time trying to find the haystack in the haystacks, right? So I think having that unified perspective on what is important for us to monitor from a security perspective, where can we gain value, where are we tapping into that types of data already from a network infrastructure perspective, you can reduce a lot of not only human labor waste, but often a lot of duplication in the tools that they're deploying as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of the things
factors come in when you're talking about current technologies, utilizing cloud, having the Internet of Things, IoT type devices, and enabling them yet locking them down. A lot of them don't have the inherent capabilities that the more static network devices or networked devices have in the past. So you're needing to get down to the application levels for security rather than looking at just the perimeter. You're needing to get rid of the point solutions that have been doing solely networking or solely security. Matt mentioned IDSs and things like that. You can't just rely on those types of tools anymore. It needs to be at the application layer that these assets are being secured.
Mm-hmm. And you also need to have, you mentioned cloud, and that brings up a question I was going to ask later, but I'll ask it now. People are starting to, embrace cloud. Obviously, that's nothing new, but that's almost like in this picture here, it's almost like yet another silo, right? So it's almost like there's a network team, a security team, and now there's this sort of wholly independent cloud team that's able to sort of go out and do what they want to do. So does this problem simply extend into the cloud and just get worse there?
It does to some extent. The real challenge there is the visibility that's lost within the cloud. Being able to see what happens in the cloud, where is the information stored, how is it stored, where are the cross-tenant vulnerabilities and different things like that you have to protect against. And the challenge is working with your cloud provider. If you don't have your own cloud environment and you're utilizing things like Google Cloud and Azure and AWS and those types of things, you lose that visibility and that control that you typically had in the past when everything was yours. And you were just protecting at the edge. You don't have that edge anymore. Now you're going out onto the internet in order to access your information and transport that information across the internet to be able to serve it to the end users no matter where they are because of the mobile workforces these days. So it really complicates matters there and causes even yet another component of it, dealing with the cloud provider. The service providers need to be able to coordinate with you and provide that visibility, as well as the tools that you're implementing these days in order to monitor and manage that activity need to address those aspects as well.
I think, my perspective on cloud is, the tooling to get you the data that you need is getting a lot better, and that's because the market is demanding it, right? They're asking for it, so a lot of these providers are incorporating that capability. But as with other technology initiatives, it's something that requires some prior planning and discussion prior to the deployment of that solution or that migration to the cloud that should include the infrastructure network and the security teams, right, with a unified plan. One issue that I think that I see over and over and over again in the 25 years that I've been doing this is that new initiatives are put forth without that discussion with the security team. And then security becomes a retrofit, it becomes an add-on, it becomes a cost. It actually becomes a cost, not just from a dollars perspective, but maybe a cost on the impact and performance. So making sure that you have a kind of unified plan and strategy for the deployment to the cloud that brings all of these players together, again, to identify what is important, how they're going to manage it, what the security profile needs to be, will save you an incredible amount of heartache.
Yeah, it's sort of that truth, I guess, or the stereotype, right? That security is always the blocker, right? But if you bring them along and make them part of that whole process of planning and how you're going to leverage it and what you're going to do, that becomes a lot simpler. And that's another way to break down barriers.
Yeah, bring security into the design process. I mean, many years ago, I did a job in the private sector for an IP satellite communication company. And we went in and talked with them. We wrote a proposal. We went in and did our orals. We won. We did the kickoff meeting, walked away with all the documentation around the satellite, came back and said, okay, we're ready to bang on this thing in the lab. And the company said, what do you mean in the lab? Like, well, we were doing the assessment. They had already launched it into space. And I had to tell them, you recognize the value that we can provide from a security perspective is greatly diminished by the fact that this satellite's already in space. Right? Same with the migration to the cloud. You want to involve the security team and have that dialogue from the beginning, build it into the design process, make sure that everybody's on the same page. Then you don't run into this issue where you're accepting a lower security posture because security wasn't consulted, or security is added as a bolt-on and increasing the cost to the organization.
Right. Do it right from the get-go and avoid all those problems later. Yep. Excellent. Well, so, my guess is that, a lot of executives probably think that they've done enough to break down these silos, whether that's by making some, new organizational alignment or change, or pushing an agenda of cooperation, or by, building operating processes that try to tightly integrate these functions. What I'm hearing, though, is they probably aren't as far along as they expect. So what's the impact of that reality for those executives, right? So what challenge is this going to present to them?
I think the challenge is often because those silos exist, right, in the organizations that I've dealt with at the CEO level and even at the board of directors level, and they often don't have the technology perspective or background in order to deconflict what they're hearing from the parties. In fact, I remember meeting with one board, and they said, we're so glad that you're in here to help us because we feel like we're being held technologically hostage to our network and security teams because we don't understand what they're saying. And there's an implied negligence, duty on our part to make sure the organization is taking great care in how we think about these issues, but we don't understand, and there's nobody translating, and they're not translating for each other. So I think one of the areas I've seen the most value is where they're actually bringing some of the folks that have the deep technology or the deep security background in at the board level or in at the C-suite level to help with that translation and integration of the messaging, right? I've seen organizations try and solve it with a combined approach by having the two entities report up to one person and hoping that the deconfliction occurs there. Sometimes yes, sometimes doesn't, right? I mean, we'd never have perfect symmetry. A lot of times the person they're reporting to is more heavily on security or more heavily on technology. You never see that kind of true balance. This is not unique to network and infrastructure in cybersecurity. We're also seeing it with physical security and cybersecurity, right? Those two are becoming so converged that you have organizations like some of the top banks in the world that are saying, we are going to have the physical and cybersecurity components report to one person to deconflict. You're seeing that as well in some of these other organizations on the IT network and security issues.
Mm-hmm. And that also sort of goes back to that risk management discussion we had, right? If you have one person who's responsible for the whole portfolio, they're going to be probably better equipped to, identify where those risks exist and be able to prioritize what we're going to address and when, right?
Sure.
Exactly. Yeah. And you can't get away from, or you're starting to see organizations getting away from the executive levels, just kind of turning a blind eye and saying, okay, you go off and take care of that. I don't understand that. With a lot of these different, major breaches these days, and in recent years, Target, Sony, Home Depot, all of those, and seeing that the CEOs are now being held accountable for it, not necessarily pushing it down to the CISO, CSO, and just saying, oh, I don't understand that. That's really becoming a major factor in kind of achieving one of the things that we talked about earlier as far as hurdles, getting the management buy-in, getting executive buy-in to the dollars that need to be applied to it, the manpower that needs to be applied to it, and the subject matter expertise that needs to be applied to it, whether it be internal or, as Matt was talking about, bringing in external expertise in order to have that second set of eyes. You do that with, financial reviews. Why don't you do that with security reviews as well?
Yeah.
You need that kind of independent, autonomous organization that comes in and tells you the real story behind what's going on and brings in those lessons learned from multiple environments versus just your closed environment.
And I've argued for a number of years that it's time to start bringing cybersecurity experts onto the board of directors, right? You have major companies that have millennial experts that, just are within a particular age group because that market is so important to them that they want that segment to be represented at the board level. Cybersecurity is so important to so many of these organizations that it's time that we start to bring that technical expertise into a legitimate independent type board representation. I think that will, help greatly in solving and deconflicting some of these issues at the top.
And does that take the form of
You're starting to see that a little bit more these days within the technology arena and large corporations related to technology, but the financial, the healthcare arena, those different types of organizations still are kind of a little bit in the dark ages these days of, well, that's the technology stuff. We don't get involved in that at the business level. They really need to get involved in at the business level because the business is really what it's serving, protecting that business information, the intellectual property of the organization, the assets related to the organization need to be protected. And who better to say what is important and what's not important so that you're applying your dollars properly in the organization when you're implementing the different security solutions and bringing in different resources in order to secure what you want to lock down.
Yeah. So one of the things, I forget who mentioned it earlier, but it was this idea that the role of the CISO, much like the role of the CIO, probably a decade and a half ago, has started to get elevated quite a bit. And are we running into a issue where people in these roles sometimes just aren't equipped to have those sort of business conversations with other C-levels and people on the board? Is that part of the problem here?
I think it's definitely part of the problem, not in each instance, right? Again, and it's equipping themselves with the capability to discuss kind of the risk trade-offs that exist within an organization. It was last year, year before last, I actually did an entire presentation that I called "When Hackers Brief the Board," right? How you bridge that technology gap, that security gap, and also effective communication strategies, getting them to understand, right, the importance of what you're saying, or the decision that you're asking them for counsel on, or that you're providing to them, you know, in hopes to make or support. So we definitely need to solve those communication issues as well, to make sure that the executive team that is used to dealing with risk, right? We pretend like risk management is unique to cybersecurity when it isn't, right? All organizations, all business engage in risk management. It's just of a different flavor. We need to get them to understand how to manage risk in this domain. That requires an education and communication process along the way.
Mm-hmm. Very good.
Absolutely, and kind of the same evolution that we went through for just IT in general is now happening with security as well. Back in the day, IT leadership typically came from the head of finance within the organization. Why that happened, not quite sure, but that's really where IT used to fall. Now these days, you're seeing that same thing where it's, oh, well, you know technology, so you should know security. That's not necessarily true, and especially when you're taking somebody from a network or an operations type environment and what they've been used to operating underneath, and trying to say, well, you know technology, so handle the security for us. There's a different breed there for the security aspects, and you really need to address those individually with the right types of resources.
Yeah, fully agree. Okay, so shifting gears a little bit, I think it'd be, you know, truly bad form to have a webinar like this and only talk about the problems with, you know, the status quo. We also really want to hear some solutions to go along with the problem. So based on what you two have seen in customers that have been successful in bridging this gap, what can you recommend as an initial strategy to overcome these issues?
Sure. I think, you know, the kind of quick, low-hanging fruit there is really at the tier 1, tier 2 type levels. At the tier 1, tier 2 type levels, they go through the same type of thing. They're the 724, 365 monitoring aspects and reporting aspects and action taking to mitigate, whether it be a network or a security component there, an incident there. Taking that level and integrating those two is probably the quickest and easiest. They're using the same trouble ticketing systems, same types of knowledge containers, knowledge management platforms, so that they can get to resolution quicker. Merging those two and merging the individuals within those two functions there really gives you the most bang for the buck right off the bat. But you can't just throw them both together. There has to be that cross-training. There has to be that cross-pollination between the different groups to be able to let the network administrators understand what vulnerabilities are, how they're acted on, why they're acted on, and how to decipher between the false and the accurate actions there.
I would say from my perspective, where I've seen organizations successful, it's where they recognize the commonality between the two teams is typically at an infrastructure level, right? I mean, the network is important to both of them. Infrastructure like DNS and authentication are important to both of them, right? So creating a unified strategy that's kind of bottom up with regards to things that you just can't escape from, that both teams are reliant on. I've seen some achieve great success with co-location, where you've got the network and IT folks right next to the security folks. It's as simple as popping up from your desk or walking over and asking somebody a question, right? So you get that deconflicting, the sharing of knowledge, what I like to call the campfire type approach, right? Where you're learning through collaboration and being able to lean over somebody's shoulder. And another piece that we found that has been useful is through red teaming, which is kind of my DNA, right? Where you create scenarios that demonstrate that codependency, that demonstrate the impact of the decisions that they're making from an attacker perspective, and get them to understand how they can take a collaborative approach in trying to prevent that type of attack, which by nature would be catastrophic to the organization from to prevent that from happening. And that usually establishes a great dialogue. It establishes that kind of level of cooperation. So in those three areas, I've seen organizations successfully bridge that gap quite effectively, right, to great benefit to the organization itself.
Mm-hmm. And that's a great segue. So let's talk more about that red teaming approach. So Matt, could you maybe expand on what this is and sort of how an organization goes about it?
Yeah, I mean, the type of red teaming that I'm a huge proponent of is different than the penetration testing or the vulnerability assessment that kind of exist within industry, right? It's where you are actually replicating the capabilities of an attacker and replicating the intent that attacker might have against your organization, right? So sitting down and saying, based on what we understand about the threat environment, what we've collected through our own threat intelligence, through threat intelligence partners, through attacks that have taken place against our peers, what do we understand about the threat actors that might target us? What capabilities do they have? How would they target us, and what is important within this organization? And make it things that are going to be impactful. Right? I think the real value of red teaming is not only to identify those vulnerabilities that allow for an attacker to be successful, but to educate the management teams all the way up to the board of directors with regards to the impact that the attack would have had on the organization. So don't impose artificial constraints, make sure that they're targeting something that's very important, and then engage in what is a no-notice team. Don't let the security team know that they're coming, don't let the network team know that they're coming, and let the attacker work through their decision tree, trying to achieve the objective that they've scoped out that this attacker would be looking to achieve, and then go back after the fact. And I think this is very important. I worked for 25 years, and up until about 2 years ago, I had a 100% success rate with every red team across hundreds of organizations and thousands of red teams. And I won't tell you which client actually stopped us a couple of years ago, but I had to stop bragging about the success rate. But what's important is that you don't just deliver a report that says, here is the attack surface that presented itself, here's how you mitigate that, here's what the consequences would have been. It is great to go back and do what I almost call kind of the playback. Here at this decision point, we made a decision to pursue this particular attack pathway. Why did we do that? You and your risk management, whether you're network or infrastructure or security, thought you had that attack pathway mitigated through this technology. Why didn't it work? Was it a sensor that was turned down too low and therefore didn't catch the attack? Was it something that was turned too high and then the analyst couldn't derive the signal from the noise? Was there a poor implementation, right? Most times we have great aspirations with regards to how we're going to implement our network, but the implementation doesn't meet those aspirations. So you have to go and kind of rebalance that as well. So I think that's an important piece, is to go back almost kind of decision by decision and look at, why did the attacker decide to pursue that particular pathway? Why did we think we had it mitigated, or maybe not, and why didn't it work? And then what corrective action can we take kind of across the entirety of the attack surface?
Mm-hmm. And the other part of
teaming really begins at kind of the stage of understanding and resigning yourself to the fact that it's not a matter of if you're going to be vulnerable. Everybody is vulnerable. You're going to get breached at one point in time. There's going to be a security incident. Really, where the red team comes in, as Matt was saying, is how do you react to that breach? How do you react to the vulnerability that was exploited by an attacker in order to mitigate the damage that's going to be done by that attacker? That can be loss of information. It can be destruction of systems. Let's look at the utilities, for instance. Just taking down a grid, which in past days that was unheard of. These days, that's starting to happen, and we're starting to see those types of vulnerabilities even in supposedly closed systems there being breached. So understanding that you are going to have an incident and really tooling up, and this is where, again, Matt was talking about, the organization that you have, the team that you have doing the red teaming needs to be kind of spread across different functionality in order to understand and collaborate on, well, I would do it this way, somebody else says they would do it this way, and those are just two of the different paths that an attacker could take to breach your network. You've really got to kind of cross-pollinate between the different organizations, the different mindsets of the people on the team, and hire within that for that specific function, so that the main objective is limiting the amount of damage that is done when you do have that type of a breach.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think, one thing I'd say to reinforce is there's the great Jack Welch quote that says you get the behavior that you measure and reward. We should be thinking about, what do we measure in security, right? For decades, it was, we ran this vulnerability scan and we had 50 high-level vulnerabilities and 75 medium and 120 low. First off, the board of directors has no idea how to interpret that type of metric. Second off, you always assume, okay, if we went from 50 to 45, we've improved our security posture, right? Not necessarily, right? You haven't necessarily managed that risk. So what are we finding that are useful metrics for organizations to track is time to detection, the efficiency of the mitigation, right? You can have a system that is Loctite that has one single vulnerability that an attacker finds to exploit. There is a huge difference in the impact that attacker will have if you detect them within 1 day, 1 hour, 1 week, 1 month, or 1 year, right? So focusing on those types of metrics, I think, becomes equally important as well.
Yeah, I mean, if you use the example of, and I know everybody jumps on them these days, but the example of the breach that the OPM, Office of Personnel Management, had with all of the different security personnel, all of the different cleared personnel, and that information being essentially lost. If you look at that one from the ground up, that was done by 2 different attackers in tandem, and one of those attackers was known. The other one was resident in the environment for 2 years before they actually ever realized that they were breached. And so being able to sit there and not be detected was one of the main factors that enabled them to, when the Windows vulnerability came about, exploit that and then be able to execute what they wanted to do 2 years prior to that. So as Matt was saying, being able to understand and identify those security breaches in a timely manner is really critical. Had they been able to identify that 2 years, even a year prior to that, it wouldn't have happened. So you've really got to be on top of that aspect of it, and that's where your red team comes in as being extremely valuable to you. If you're constantly trying to do what the attacker is doing and finding those different variations as you implement new technologies, as you implement new applications into the environment, that's the time to really be testing it, not waiting for something to happen.
Yeah. So let me ask you a question. My history with red teams is, a few years ago, everybody was hiring companies to do this, right? And now it seems everybody is building up their own internal capability to have, their own red teams going after their infrastructure. Is one approach better than the other, or should we be doing both?
My perspective is you have to be. Go ahead, Phil.
I was going to say I would take the approach of both. You have to be somewhat self-sufficient, because no matter how good the external team is, they don't necessarily know your environment specifically. You need those resources from internally that know where all of the call them dead bodies, if you will, are buried within the architecture there. They know, well, we didn't opt for this because it was a little bit more expensive, and we opted for this, but it does present these different risks, these different vulnerabilities. An outsider doesn't necessarily know those types of things. They would have to hunt around for that and hopefully trip over those types of things as they're hunting around and identifying what your architecture looks like that way. A lot of social engineering comes into that as well, and understanding, understanding how people operate within the environment and how those types of human things can be exploited. So you've got to take that collective pool of internal knowledge and work along with the external resources that are doing that across the board and seeing much more than what you're seeing internally.
Yeah, I think it is, where you want to have both types of activities taking place in the organization, obviously. I mean, I'm a big fan of zero notice red team from external third parties, because that is what is able to most closely emulate the perspective that an attacker has. And that is an important piece to bring into that perspective. Also, the external teams are working across lots of different customers, lots of different infrastructure. They're able to bring best practices and cross-fertilize those, not just within an organization, but between different organizations. One other aspect, I think, with the internal red team is that I'm a huge fan that if you're out there engaging in red teaming activity, that those red teamers are also hunt teams. Right? I think we get locked into this perspective of all we should be looking for is vulnerabilities, but by just adjusting the methodology, they can also be looking for evidence of compromise, or looking at the network from the perspective of, if I was an attacker, where would I hide out? Right? For me, it's similar to kind of the old invisible gorilla study, if you're not familiar, where you're shown a video and there's people in white t-shirts and dark t-shirts, and they ask you, count the number of times that the basketball is passed between the people in the white t-shirts. Video plays. Halfway through the video, a person in a gorilla suit walks into frame, pounds their chest, and walks out. At the end of the video, they ask, how many times does the basketball pass? Almost everybody gets that right. I think the correct answer is 14, but only 50% see the gorilla. My worry is that by having teams that are overly specialized, we're training them by design to miss the gorilla, right? So we should be enabling them to have a broader perspective. You're not just a red team, you're a red and a hunt team. You're not just a network team, you're a network plus security team, right? So creating that kind of cross collaboration and differing the mindset, I think, is beneficial as well.
Yeah, that's a great story. I'd like to take that test. I'd probably miss the gorilla.
Well, now I gave it away.
Yeah,
there's others you can do.
Kind of a letdown. All right. Well, thank you guys. So that was those were kind of the main topics for the webinar. So I wanted to pause for a minute and see if we had any questions from our audience that we could jump into before we wrap up here. So let me open up the questions panel. So here we have one. So organizationally, I think we touched on this a little bit. Organizationally, do you see network fitting under security or security fitting under network? In other words, does there need to be one boss for these things in your guys' view?
Matt, you want to try that one?
Yeah, I think eventually there needs to be one boss that is helping to mitigate the different perspectives on how to manage risk and what is important to the organization, right? It's okay to have differing opinions, differing perspectives, different values from each of those seats with regards to what you perceive as important and what initiatives might impact those missions, or what you're trying to accomplish. But at the top, there needs to be somebody that can deconflict that, right? You shouldn't have two 10-item lists. You should have one 10-item list that's been deconflicted and prioritized from the organization's perspective, right? Not the perspective of one entity. So I do feel like it is useful for there to be some measure in which those differing opinions and differing perspectives are deconflicted from an organizational perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Very much agreed. If you have at the tier 1, tier 2 levels, the teams totally integrated and working off of the same platforms and trying to achieve the same mission, securing a very productive environment, then that all needs to roll up to a single boss. There needs to be one point of accountability for that answers to the board, that integrates to the board, and really be able to unify the whole team as one.
Interesting. All right. Well, another question here. Can we have some examples of approaches to managing security at the application level for mobile devices and IoT devices without relying on tools such as IDS and perimeter protection?
Really that kind of gets down to the concept of the programmer isn't just a programmer anymore. Software developer isn't just a software developer. They have to, at that level, have the knowledge and the foresight to be building into those applications the security aspects that are necessary. Again, we're pulling it away, not doing as much of the perimeter guarding, and bringing it back to access levels and different things like that. So that's really what you need to be focusing on when you're coding systems, coding applications, creating resources that are networked together. You've got to be able to implement those different permissions and capabilities of enforcing those permissions so that you are locking the application down.
Got it.
Yeah, I think, in particular with IoT, I feel like as a technology community, we're making a critical mistake. If you rewind to the formation of the internet and actually have, the Steve Lukaszak, who was the director of DARPA at the time, quoted, and he said, had we known it was going to be this important, right? If it was going to be more than just an experiment in resilient communications, we would have thought about security from the beginning. But as a result, they didn't, right? They didn't anticipate the importance of what they were building. Find me any technologist that doesn't believe that IoT is going to be an important component of what we do in the future. Yet we're making that same mistake. We're running to these technologies, we're deploying them in our environments without giving appropriate thought to the security considerations, right? So it gets back to that security from the design perspective, building it in, whether you're manufacturing a device or you're getting ready to deploy, that you understand the security model and you're baking it in. Unfortunately, we're making the same mistakes. We're rushing into a new technology space that we know is going to be critical, that we know that we're plugging into vital components of our networks and our infrastructures without giving appropriate consideration to how we're going to secure those devices.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, and I think one of the complicating factors to that, and kind of moving up in the alphabet soup, taking the IoT aspects and looking at the APIs that are associated with them. Those APIs are really becoming a vulnerability point, and an area that the attackers are focusing on. Because if you think about it, the API is supposed to open that device up so that you can easily interface to it with another application, another device, connecting things together. When you do that, again, you're getting into how open and how closed should it be in order to protect what is behind that. And that's really where, again, from a programming perspective, how you're designing those APIs really comes into effect as to how secure will that device, will that entity on your network be in the future.
Yeah. And hence we get into these situations like we've seen recently where we have, hundreds of thousands or millions of those devices being, taken over and used as botnets, right, for denial of service or other purposes. They're just wide open.
Yep. If you think about it, think about your printers on the network. That is the quickest and easiest place for somebody to hide out and have inject vulnerabilities into your network that they can exploit at a later date. That's something that nobody ever looks at. All these different Internet of Things, all these different games and different things like that you put on your network today, that's totally opening up even more than just that managed device that you have on the network. Now you're injecting those other kind of rogue devices that everybody's just bringing into the network.
Right. There's a huge supply chain component of that as well that we would engage in red teaming. If your organization receives a printer that says it's from HP and says, thank you for being a loyal customer, here's our latest printer, all we ask is after 30 days you fill out this survey, how many companies do you think actually sit down and say, where did I get this from? Why am I getting it? No, they say, who asked for a printer last? And they ship it off to them and it gets plugged into the network, right? No verification, no integrity, arrived without being ordered, right? So we've used that tactic, multiple times just to inject stuff to demonstrate the supply chain vulnerability around some of this as well. I've done it with mobile phones, sending an executive who's tech savvy and has a lot of Twitter followers of the latest version of a mobile device saying, will you be part of our tech influencer program? The appeal of deploying those new technologies, even if we can't appropriately source where they came from, is also great as well.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Okay, great. Here's another one. So what can a non-C-suite person with not much influence on the C-suite do to about this conflict of priorities?
What can I not? I think it gets back to that communication aspect of it, right? I mean, if you're in an organization in one of these capacities, you're playing a role in which there is something of value that's being communicated up the chain, right? So finding appropriate ways to communicate risk, to communicate different perspectives, right? Whether it's through the use of analogy, truth to power, whatever it may be. I mean, each person kind of has to find the strategy that works for them, but it really is about communicating those things that are important and finding effective ways to engage in that communication. I have seen also over the years very ineffective methods for how to communicate with senior management or how to articulate a particular idea or concern. So I think to have the greatest impact, figure out the best way to communicate the things that you're concerned with, or to communicate what you think some of the priorities should be.
Mm-hmm.
Don't assign yourself to the red team and demonstrate how vulnerable the network is. I've seen that not work out very well for folks as well.
Got it. All right, here's another good one. So do any public sources of red team attacks or processes exist for companies to leverage, even something specific to, say, federal, state, or other industry vertical?
I think for that, one good source is the SANS Institute. They definitely have a lot of information regarding forming a red team and what the red team objectives are. That would be a good source there to start for, especially for smaller organizations.
Yeah, I know some of my former colleagues at FusionX have given lots of presentations at Black Hat, DEF CON, and B-Sides and conferences like that step through lessons learned, ways to structure red teams, different value propositions for different types of red teams. There is certainly a ton of material. If you just searched on FusionX and red teaming, you'd find multiple videos that are very accessible that you could watch to learn more, to help guide your process. And there are organizations like the SANS Institute, as well as numerous books that exist that focus in on this topic.
All right. Excellent. I think we have time for one more, and I apologize, we're not going to be able to get to all the questions that have been asked, but let's close out with this one. Somebody's asking about other functions. We sort of talked about cloud, but he's talking about DevOps, right? They seem to function outside a lot of the traditional security and network constraints in order to be able to go fast. What should we be concerned about there?
To me, that's a bit of a broken record type perspective, right? It's the, you hear folks champion DevSecOps as well, right? So let's build security back into the equation. Let's make sure that the libraries that we're building that are going to be used over and over and over again are going to be secure, right? I talked with Jeff Moss, the founder of the Black Hat and DEF CON conferences a couple years ago. We had an idea of, let's initiate a challenge that says, when you go and search for common code examples on Google, let's go and replace them with ones that are securely developed, right? Or in the most, 10 most common programming textbooks, let's go through and make sure that the examples that are in there are written from a security perspective, right? So it's that baking security in from the beginning, creating that culture where security is important, making sure that the foundation that you build off has a security incorporated into it as well, is to me much more important for most industries than the benefits you get of just taking a very rapid approach to development.
Open sources really present a lot of vulnerability from a security perspective there, because when you are utilizing that, think of how many others are utilizing that as well in order to inject that component into the development cycle, shorten the development cycle. But that is just kind of, in many cases, stamped from one to another throughout multiple different organizations. If you're looking to do a widespread type of attack, what are you going to look for? Commonalities between the different organizations. Where can we exploit what that is the same across multiple organizations? That's really where you're kind of becoming one of the herd that's going to get attacked. So when you do, if you do, and you probably will, because it is effective to use open source as far as cost-cutting measures, when you do engage in utilizing that, put your own special sauce to it. Really take it, understand it, number one, and understand the vulnerabilities that it may present, and then modify that to meet your specific needs there. And in many cases, that'll make your application run a lot more efficiently and effectively as well.
Right.
So really be careful of what you're injecting into there so that you're not the cast of thousands that's getting breached.
Right. Excellent point. All right, and we are going to have to close on that note. So everyone on the webinar here, please, thank you for attending. Watch your inbox for a copy of the recording coming out in the next couple of days. But yeah, thank you for your time today. And Phil and Matt specifically, thank you so much for joining us and for answering these questions. Really enjoyed the conversation, and look forward to doing it again.
My pleasure.
Absolutely.
It was a lot of fun.
Thank you, Scott. Appreciate you walking us through this.
Of course. Bye all.
Take care.